नमस्कार। क्यापिटल टेलिभिजन एचडी हेरेर बसिरहनुभएका आदरणीय दर्शकबिनहरू सम्पूर्णमा हार्दिक नमस्कार अनि अभिवादन। आदरणीय दर्शकबिन, हामीले क्यापिटल विशेषमा विशेष व्यक्तित्वसँग रहेर विशेष कुराकानी प्रस्तुत गर्दै आइरहेका छौँ। आज हामीसँग एकजना यस्तो विशेष अतिथि हुनुहुन्छ जसले नेपालको शान्ति प्रक्रियामा होस् अथवा नेपालका ऐतिहासिक दस्तावेज कायम गर्नलाई होस् महत्त्वपूर्ण भूमिका खेल्नु भएको छ। दर्शकबिन, हामीले भन्दै आएका छौँ क्यापिटल विशेष यस अर्थले पनि विशेष छ कि यसमा केही पर्दा पछाडि बसेका तर अत्यन्तै सान्दर्भिक र अत्यन्तै गर्विला विषयवस्तुहरू प्रस्तुत गर्दै आइरहेका छौँ। आज हामीसँग एकजना अतिथि हुनुहुन्छ। उहाँ हामीबाट अलिक टाढा देशको हुनुहुन्छ भूगोलले, तर आत्मीयताले, मनले, मुटुले उहाँ नेपालीसँग जोडिनु भएको छ। अमेरिकी नागरिक हुनुहुन्छ, विशेषज्ञ हुनुहुन्छ, स्पेशलिस्ट हुनुहुन्छ। हाम्रो लागि त अझ साँच्चै भन्ने हो भने नेपालको लागि, नेपालीको लागि अत्यन्तै आत्मीय, अत्यन्तै प्रिय, डियरेस्ट एन्ड भेरी रेस्पोन्सिबल पर्सनालिटी हुनुहुन्छ। उहाँ मैले कुरा गर्न लागिरहेको व्यक्तित्व हुनुहुन्छ। नेपालमा रहेर, नेपालमा बसेर उहाँले नेपालको ऐतिहासिक दस्तावेजहरू जुन हामी नेपालीले गर्नु पर्थ्यो त्यो कामलाई उहाँले लामो समय अन्वेषण र अनुसन्धान गर्नुभएको छ, रिसर्च गर्नुभएको छ। त्यसै गरी उहाँको शान्ति प्रक्रियामा उहाँले एउटा भलन्टियरको रूपमा नेपालमा लामो समय काम गर्नुभएको छ। द्वन्द्व रूपान्तरणमा पनि उहाँको काम छ भने यसै गरी ऐतिहासिक दस्तावेजहरू, इतिहासलाई खोल्ने क्रममा अनि रेलोजी नेपाल जस्ता टपिक्सहरूमा उहाँले निकै साहित्यहरू पनि, निकै कृतिहरू पनि नेपाली साहित्यलाई दिइसक्नु भएको छ। आदरणीय दर्शकबिन, हामीसँग आज हुनुहुन्छ ड्यानियल डब्ल्यू एडवर्ड्स पिएचडी, अथवा हामी उहाँलाई ड्यान एडवर्ड्स पनि भन्छौँ। उहाँ अमेरिकन नागरिक हुनुहुन्छ। नागरिकताको हिसाबले एज अ सिटिजनसिप हि इज अमेरिकन, बट बाई हार्ट हि लुक्स लाइक नेपाली। नेपाली बोल्नुहुन्छ, बिस्तारै बोल्नुहुन्छ। आज हामी उहाँसँग केही अन्तरङ्ग कुराकानी गर्नेछौँ। उहाँको योगदान नेपालमा कस्तो रह्यो र अहिले नेपालको सन्दर्भमा नेपालको समाज, नेपालको साहित्यिक अवस्था, नेपालको ऐतिहासिक कुराहरूलाई उहाँले कसरी हेर्नुभएको छ, यो विषयमा हामी कुराकानी गर्नेछौँ। दर्शकबिन, तपाईँले यो कार्यक्रम क्यापिटल टेलिभिजन एचडी, त्यसै गरी क्यापिटल एफएम लगायत अन्य देशका 37वटा एफएमहरू र क्यापिटल सिएमटी ग्रुपको अनलाइन एप मार्फत विश्वभरबाट हामीलाई हेर्न र पढ्न सक्नुहुनेछ। फ्रम द वर्ल्ड वाइड यु हेभ टु सेन्ड अस। ओके, हामी अब सुरु गर्दैछौँ। आजका हाम्रा अतिथि एकदमै स्पेसल, क्यापिटल विशेषमा विशेष व्यक्तित्व ड्यान एडवर्डलाई हार्दिक स्वागत छ यहाँलाई हाम्रो कार्यक्रममा।
नमस्कार जी।
हजुर, अब यहाँ
सुन्नुहोस् न, तपाईँले भन्नुभएको कुरा मैले बुझेँ, तर नेपालीमा बोल्दा अलिक गाह्रो छ मलाई।
ठिक छ, इङ्ग्लिसमै बोल्नु होला। यहाँले दुवै ल्याङ्ग्वेज प्रयोग गर्न सक्नुहुन्छ। मेरो कुरा बुझ्नु भइहाल्छ। बुझ्नुहुन्छ। कहिलेदेखि नेपाल बस्नु भएको छ? When did you come from Nepal?
2023 सालमा आएको थिएँ। यो राजा महेन्द्रको पालोमा।
राजा महेन्द्रको पालोमा 2023 सालमा।
अनि त्यो बेलामा मैले धारिङ स्कुलमा पढाएको थिएँ, भलन्टियर, पिस कोर भलन्टियर। अनि त्यहाँबाट बनिपा आजाद हाई स्कुलमा गएर पढाएको। आजाद हाई स्कुल। अनि त्यसपछि सेन्ट जेभियर्स जावलकलमा 1969मा 25 सालमा 1 वर्ष पढाएको। त्यसपछि अमेरिका फर्केर अनि युनिभर्सिटी अफ शिकागोमा पिएचडी को लागि पढेको थिएँ। अनि फेरि नेपाल आएर अनि यो रिसर्च अनुसन्धान गरेको। राणा प्रकाशको
पद्म शमशेर
होइन, यो के अरे, यो
मोहन शमशेर जङ्गबहादुर
एडमिनिस्ट्रेसन है, यो ब्युरोक्रेसी। अनि त्यसपछि मैले अमेरिकामा यो टेलिकम्युनिकेसन्स के भन्छ, दूरसञ्चारको कम्पनीमा काम गरेको। अनि त्यसपछि अमेरिकन सरकारको काम गरेको, यो कमर्स डिपार्टमेन्ट है। अनि रिटायर्ड भएको अब 12 दिन भयो। 12 वर्ष भयो। 12
years before you are retired from the job in America.
अनि के अरे, रिटायर्ड भएपछि म हरेक वर्षमा नेपाल आउँछु, साथीहरूलाई भेट्छु। अनि फेरि अनुसन्धान गरेको थिएँ। अनि यो नेपालमा कतिवटा 75 जिल्लाहरू,
75 डिस्ट्रिक्ट,
सबै
now 77.
73 मा पुगेको है।
पछि यहाँले चाहिँ निकै लामो समय नेपालमा सेवा दिइराख्नु भएको छ। तपाईँ आउनु भएको बेलाको नेपाल र अहिलेको नेपाल, what is difference between before and after?
All right, let me speak in English.
Yeah,
please.
okay, sir.
In 1966, in Kathmandu,
Yeah,
there were very few taxis, very few vehicles. I went everywhere by bicycle.
yeah,
And at that time, too, everybody was using firewood, daura.
yeah.
No, there was no gas.
No gas.
And so in the morning, there would be some pollution, a little cloud of pollution above Kathmandu Valley, but by 10, 11 o'clock, it would disappear.
Yeah,
So from Kathmandu, in the fall, you could see the mountains, the Himalayas.
Himalayas. Yeah,
Nowadays, Kathmandu is full of pollution,
polluted city.
polluted city, very crowded, traffic jams. So the charm of Kathmandu has disappeared, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But I still come because many of my students are now grandfathers, and their sons and daughters are living in America, living in Australia, living in Europe.
Mhm.
So I see them, and I like to hire a vehicle and a driver for 1 or 2 weeks and go to different places in Nepal, because before there were very few roads. Well, when I first came, there was no road from Kathmandu to Pokhara.
No roads.
No road. And the Tribune Rajpath, of course, was open.
Yeah,
And I think the road to Kodari
Kodari.
had been open. So I consider Nepal a second home. And I stay in a very reasonably priced hotel. I will never stay in Solti Hotel,
Yeah.
Annapurna Hotel,
yeah.
Radisson Hotel.
Akaneti.
Why pay, $60, $70, $100 a day?
Yeah,
So I stay in a reasonable hotel.
regional hotel. Yeah.
And I stay about 2 months, and then I return to America.
Okay, so what should you do in Nepal when you stay here?
Well, for a number of years, I did research
Yeah.
on the railways of Nepal, because when I was young, I got very interested in railways in America.
Yeah,
And there were 2 railways here in Nepal. Actually, recently only the Janikpur Railway.
Janak Railway. Yeah,
And nobody had written about the railway. So I went to the National Archives here and looked for documents, which are very difficult to find. And I met people whose fathers or grandfathers had worked for the railways. And in America, I have hundreds and hundreds of books on Nepal.
yeah.
And so I searched
100 books on Nepal.
many
Yeah,
hundreds of books.
many.
And so I searched
Several books.
So I searched them for references.
Yeah,
So in this book, maybe one reference, this reference. So
yeah,
then the other thing I did was many British and European rail fans
yeah,
had come to India in the 1980s and 1990s to ride the steam trains. To ride the steam trains in India.
yeah.
And then they would go to Jayanagar
Jayanagar. Yeah,
often without a Nepali visa. To ride the Janikpur Railway. And at that time, the border was open. There was no immigration. There was no customs. So they would ride from Jayanagar up to Janikpur, and nobody looked at their passport or their visa. And then they went back to Jayanagar. But they took a lot of photographs.
yeah,
And so I made connection with these mostly elderly men in the UK. And they sent me their photographs that they had taken 30, 40 years ago. And so those photos I've put in my book, and a lot of documents. So I realize that there's not a lot of interest in Nepal on the old railways, but nobody had written on it, and I was interested in railways, and so I also went to Tribune Library and read the old newspapers in English. Also, there were some Nepali newspapers. So I've that was a work, but I completed that work last year.
yeah.
So this year I have no research project.
Research. You have been doing works in research project nowadays also.
Well, now, as I said, I finished that last year. So
This last year.
this year I'm planning to go to the Malpi School in Panoti and teach for 1 month as a volunteer.
Yeah,
Because I have not taught in Nepal for more than 50 years. And the children, of course, the young people have changed a lot in that time. You say, what has changed in Nepal? In the Daring school, there were very few girls that were enrolled. And also there were not that many. The classes were quite small, and it was only through 8th class. There was no high school. The whole district of Dotting, there was no high school. There were no roads. There was no electricity. There were no factories, no industry. And so nowadays, of course, I've gone again to Dotting Basie, which did not exist when I first came. And so there's been a tremendous change in Nepal. Of course, at that time, there were no iPhones and no internet and no television.
Yeah. Nowadays, are you satisfied to being the developing sector, like education, like human behavior, humanities, and social sector? Are you satisfied to see this?
Well, again, since I'm not a permanent resident here, when I'm here, I buy the Kathmandu Post and the Himalayan Times every day, so I read the newspapers, and those papers are online in America. So, my knowledge of contemporary Nepal is limited, and if you read the newspapers, just like in the American newspapers, they often focus on the problems, the negative, the challenges. And so while Nepal has made a lot of progress, of course, there are still things that are evolving. But I wanted to mention the young students, because I had dinner last night with a family, and the young woman has got her bachelor's degree in computer science or IT, and is planning to get a master's degree, maybe in America or another country. And that was unheard of 50 years ago. At that time, the women there were a few women teachers in Kathmandu. They could be nurses. And then there were a few airline stewardesses for RNAC. But otherwise, most women did not have jobs and stayed at home. So, that's been a big change in Nepal that I've noticed.
Nowadays, everywhere we can see women.
Right.
In office, in every sector of the projection.
But of course, the women have problems here, just like they have in America. In terms of being harassed sometimes, or being disrespected, or feeling that they're not treated equally to men, or they're not getting the equal pay, that sort of thing. So, but this is true in all countries, even in the developed world. So Nepal is making some progress, and of course the politics has changed a lot, because when I first came, of course, King Mahendra was in office. And then I was here when King Birendra was coronated in 1972, I believe. And then, then when democracy, a better form of democracy, happened in 1990, I was in America. When I was working in America, I didn't come very often to Nepal, because I had a job there, I had a family, I had only 2 or 3 weeks of leave every year. So I didn't come to Nepal very often in the 1990s, early 2000s. But since I've retired, as I say, I come once or twice a year to Nepal.
You come to Nepal. Right. Okay, you have written several books on Nepal.
Right.
Likewise, this book and this one is also Nepal in Black and White, 1956 to 1975. Right. Next one. This one is Green Energy Transportations in Nepal. This is 1975-2008. What about it? This and next one, it is the first Peace Corps Days, the Kathmandu Valley. Right. It is so important books. You have been doing the volunteer Peace Corps in Nepal.
Peace Corps, right? These were the slides that I took 40 and 50 years ago.
40 and 50
years ago, from 1966 to 1975. And mostly of the Kathmandu Valley, a little bit in Dotting and Banipa. And I've labeled them, and I've also attached a bibliography. I told you I have many books on Nepal in America. And so I printed this book in Nepal about five or 6 years ago. Five or six years ago. Right. So that was the first book, and then the Nepal in Black and White.
Nepal in Black and White. This is 1956 to 1975. This era.
Right. Now there was a gentleman that came to Nepal in 1959, an American. He was a mining engineer and worked for the Bureau of Mines, and he took photos in Kathmandu in about 1960, 60 years ago. So I put some of those photos in there, as well as photos that I took on black and white. And also, for instance, my trekking permit in 1968, there's a copy of that in there. In those days, it was difficult if you wanted to leave the Kathmandu Valley, you had to get a trekking permit from His Majesty's government.
Yeah.
And it said, where you were going and why you were going and so on. Now I know that still foreigners have to get some kind of permit now to visit some of these places in Nepal, but and then other materials, books that were written on Nepal, other photographs are in that book.
This one is also Green Energy and Transportation Nepal, the Kathmandu Bhaktapur trolley bus.
See,
it is the history, not in our country now.
No, you see, Nepal, they're talking now about green energy and using electricity instead of petrol.
Yeah.
And Nepal was really a leader in that aspect because the Chinese government built a trolleybus system that went from Tripuri-Sor to Suribanaik in Bhaktapur. And it started in 1975. And I actually rode that bus, and I took that photo.
Yeah. And
the history of that, when I was doing research on the railways, I also wrote down material about that trolley bus. And it ran for a while, but it had a lot of problems, and the problems that it had are all described in this book. Getting spare parts, the fares, the competition, the management problems, etc., etc. So this is really like a monograph. It's not really a large book, but so as I said before, that was and a lot of people may not realize that the government in the 1980s was talking about building other trolleybus systems, from maybe Biratnagar to Dharan, and maybe in Butol, Pokhara, and so on. So they talked about it, but they never did anything. And so this bus, it stopped really running about 2002. Mm-hmm. And but it was a good example of Nepal using green energy in transportation.
Yeah. Next one, this is the book America Meets Nepal, 1944 to 1952.
Right.
Problems, personalities, and political change. Yeah. It is so historical account.
So what this book was based, when I worked in Washington, D.C., the U.S. National Archives are located near Washington. And I went about 25 years ago and asked to see the records that they had about Nepal. And the U.S. State Department had 2 or 3 boxes of records. Mm-hmm. And at that time, again, there were digital cameras, so I photocopied a lot of records. And I have a box in my house, of records. Yeah. And for 20 years, I did nothing with them. Well, last year I decided I should use those records. And so I have taken those documents and taken certain portions of those documents to describe the first Americans that came up to Nepal after World War II, and they met with the prime ministers and at that time the Ranas, and they kept a record of what they saw, what they were told, and so on. And so these are the records that are in this book. And then, of course, at that time, 1947-48, the Congress Party in India was organizing to overthrow the Ranas. Yeah. And so those records, there's reference to B.P. Korala and Garneshwan Singh. And at that time, too, of course, India was very concerned about what was going on in Nepal. So the American ambassador in India, there was no embassy, there was no U.S. embassy in Nepal until 1959. So the American ambassador in New Delhi was talking to the members of the Indian government about what India was doing in Nepal. So those records are also in here. And so those are really unique records because I don't think the British records may be available in London. I don't think the Indian records have been made public. Yeah. And it mentions, when King Tribhuvan went to Delhi, and there was an agreement that Nehru mediated, and then King Tribhuvan came back to Kathmandu in 1951, and there was a provisional government, and there was a lot of political instability at that time. Yeah. Similar to today. That's one thing that's not really changed much in Nepal. Yeah. Yeah. And so those records are in this book, And there was also an interesting conversation that B.P. Corella had in 1953 in Calcutta. And he talks about his view and the great influence that the Indian government is having in Kathmandu and the opposition to this. So these are some of the highlights of this book. This was published here in Kathmandu last year. Last year, and I'm have copies available if people are interested. There's some of the local bookstores, and and on the cover there's a picture of Kathmandu taken in 1948 from
picture
from Darara. It was taken from Darara in 1948.
1948.
And you see that in the main part of Kathmandu, near Sundara and so on, there were a lot of buildings. But of course, again, that's all changed since then.
आदरणीय दर्शकबिन अहिले हामी कुरा गरिरहेका छौं अमेरिकी नागरिक तर नेपालको पीस अलायन्समा होस् अथवा धेरै शिक्षामा स्वयंसेवा गरेर नेपालको लागि आफ्नो दोस्रो घर भनेर भनिसक्नु भएको छ उहाँले हैन यसरी काम गरिराख्नु भएका आदरणीय व्यक्तित्व हुनुहुन्छ अमेरिकामा जन्मिएर अमेरिकाबाट डिग्री लिएर अमेरिकाबाट शिक्षा लिएर पनि नेपालमा आफ्नो परिश्रमलाई खर्च गर्नु भएको छ डेनियल डब्ल्यू एडवर्ड्स उहाँलाई हामी हाम्रो भाषामा हामीले बुझ्ने भाषामा डन एडवर्ड्स भनेर पनि चिन्छौं अहिले उहाँले लेखिरहेको यो किताब अमेरिका मिट्स नेपाल यो पुस्तक चाहिँ अहिले भर्खरै लास्ट इयर मात्रै लन्च भएको र यो किताब धेरै महत्त्वपूर्ण छ यसैगरी उहाँले रेलवेजको विषयमा रेलवेज इन नेपाल भनेर पनि उहाँले किताब लेख्नु भएको छ अकाउन्ट्स इन 2021 maybe
it was published.
Yes,
and let me mention that on Sunday at Madan Puruskar Pustakalya in Patan, I'm going to give a lecture on the railways of Nepal at 3 o'clock, and I understand it's open to the public, although you should try to contact the library there to let them know that you'd like to come. And I will show a lot of photographs and describe. There were at least 4 or 5 railways that ran in Nepal at one time. So I'm going to give a lecture about the railways this coming Sunday.
Coming Sunday?
Yes.
3:30?
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock.
At Patandoka.
3 p.m. At Patandoka, Madan Pustakalaya. Okay, मैले यहाँलाई अब अलिकति रमाइलो पनि नेपाल रमाइलो लाग्छ लाग्छ
माया लाग्छ
नेपाली कस्ता लाग्छन्
Nepali? Well, here again, have enjoyed meeting all sectors, all types of Nepalis. Just yesterday, I won't mention his name, but I met a bank president here in Kathmandu. At the same time, in the villages, I have met some daughters and sons of former students, who are living very simply, don't have a lot of money. So that I think is one of the interesting things that, I don't consider myself a tourist because I can get around speaking simple Nepali and the Nepalis are very appreciative. When I say something, they say, "Oh, you know all Nepali." And I say, "No, I don't know all Nepali, but I know enough to get around." But I have a great sympathy for and interest in village Nepalis because when I came in 1966, I had lived in the village, and the way of life that those people lead, and still, of course, again, people have iPhones in the village and there are roads to many of the villages, but it's still a very, very difficult life for the women and the men. And so I have a lot of interest in trying to keep up contacts with and going to the villages, and seeing how ordinary Nepalis. I say the real Nepal's outside Kathmandu, right? Outside the Kathmandu.
Real Nepali outside of Kathmandu,
Now, again, Kathmandu, I stay here because there are a lot of things to see. I know people and so forth, but I think to really understand Nepal, you need to get outside Kathmandu. And now the trekking, too. When I was here 50 years ago, I did a lot of trekking, but there were no hotels outside the village, outside the cities. When you came to a village at night, you asked, Basbasti town Paunja, and you went inside the house, and they cooked dal bhat.
Dirdo?
Not dirdo. I don't like dirdo. But
dal bhat.
So you would sleep in the house and maybe pay 300 rupees. That was how you stayed. And on the trails, you would meet very few people. Nowadays, I trekked until 4 or 5 years ago. And again, to me, the trekking experience, of course, the mountains are beautiful and the scenery is beautiful, but, everywhere there's beer and iPhones and so many people. And so I prefer the older days. I will never go to Namche Bazaar again because it's completely changed. When I was there were no hotels. Yeah. And I had a Nepali one Sherpa guide, and it was a great experience. But now, but again, I know Nepal wants tourists to come, and Nepal is a very popular tourist destination, and I think it's great that foreigners come here. But the experience, of trekking in Nepal and living in Nepal has changed so much in 50, 60 years.
Okay, Nepal is so beautiful. Nepal lies Sagarmatha, Mount Everest, Buddha, Lumbini, Swambhu, Pashupatinath temple. All of the important and religious values, historical values places.
I went to Lumbini last November. Yeah, I've been 2 or 3 times to Lumbini, but again, it's very, very impressive, the temples that have been constructed. And I did not see a lot of Westerners there. Now, of course, Indians are foreigners. There are a lot of Indians there. And of course, but I saw lots of Nepalis, and that's something else that's changed because 40, 50 years ago, very few Nepalis would travel. Well, first of all, there were no roads, or very few roads. And secondly, especially the people in Kathmandu, unless they had relatives somewhere, they would stay in Kathmandu. They'd go to India maybe. Yeah. But now I know the young people in Nepal are trekking, which I think is good, riding their motorcycles. And those, of course, the films that they take are put on YouTube. Yeah. And then people in America and Europe, can see these pictures of Nepal. I think too, in some ways though, to me it kind of spoils it. If you look at the videos before you go, then when you go, you've already seen the scenery. So I would prefer, not to see a lot of videos and go and see it for yourself. Yeah. So that would be my preference. Yeah. But anyway, it's good publicity for Nepal. And so towards the other thing that's very changed in Nepal a lot. Yeah. Of course, in the 60s, there were Gurkha soldiers, Rais, Limbus, Gurung, the Muggers. And some were in Hong Kong, and some were in Singapore, and some were in the UK. And of course, they're still Gurkha soldiers, but they're not taking as many. But there were not so many Nepalis working outside of Nepal at that time. You see, the population now is 30 million people. And so many young people are going to the Gulf states, going to India, going to Malaysia to work. And I understand why. But in some ways it's sad because I was here during the earthquake, in 2015. I was in Banipa at that time. And later,
in the period of earthquake, you were in Banipa.
I was in Banipa, right? And the house shook, but it didn't collapse, and I went outside. Yeah. But my point was later, I went on out to the village with a group that was taking relief supplies to the village. And there were almost no young men. This was in Nuoko district. Yeah. There were almost no young. I realized the young men have all left and are working outside Nepal. And there were a lot of women, there were a lot of young children, there were a lot of old people, but very few young men. In a way, this is sad because, for marriages and for family life, it's very difficult, to be separated like that for a year or two. So. Again, I know remittances is a very important part of the Nepali economy, but at the same time, again, in my view, there's needs to be more job opportunities, created in Nepal. And the census just released said that now more than half the population lives in the Tarai. Yeah. And in the hills, there are places some villages that are almost deserted. And there again, there's a need to try to bring employment opportunities and small industry and activities in the hills so that not everybody leaves the hills and goes into Tarai. They go into the Tarai, they build houses and buildings, and then the farmland disappears. So, so there's still a lot of problems in Nepal.
हामी कार्यक्रमको अन्तमा आएका छौँ। अब तपाईले नेपाल धेरै बस्नुभयो, नेपालको सेवा गर्नुभयो। नेपालमा को सबैभन्दा मनपर्ने ठाउँ कुन हो तपाईलाई?
Well, the most favorite place, that's a difficult one. I went to Solukhumbu in 1968. At that time, though, it was pristine environment, right? So there the scenery is magnificent. But trekking, from Pokhara to Jomsom, I trekked 2 times. I've trekked in Ganeshimal. So I would say, central Nepal, Pokhara, and eastern Nepal. It's very hard to just choose one one place. I also like Darjeeling. And one reason in Darjeeling is everybody speaks Nepali. So I've gone several times to Darjeeling, and so that too is a very beautiful place. Although it is getting somewhat decrepit and not maintained very well because of population and so on. But still, it's a very nice place. So it's nowadays. Again, it's very difficult to choose just one place because all through the hill region, when it's clear and you can see the mountains and you see the villages, the hillsides, and I take a lot of photos. So, I like all of Nepal, really. Tarai, I rode the Janikpur train last year. Tarai, of course, is not as scenic as the hills, but it's the breadbasket of Nepal.
Yeah.
The climate is very, very warm, too warm for me, but and I think that the tours, as you say, Lumbini's in the Tarai, and there are a lot of well-known places in the Tarai. Bardia National Park, I went there last year. So anyway, all of Nepal is very interesting. Different groups, different languages, different customs.
Yeah.
So.
Different language, different custom, different tradition.
Right.
Different types of, varieties of society.
Right, that's right.
In our country.
Right, and that's, again, everybody knows that there's a tremendous diversity in Nepal.
Yeah, diversity,
diversity of languages, of peoples, and so on. And, of course, the modern world is encroaching on Nepal, but that's happening everywhere.
Yeah.
And as I say, it's sad that if the best educated young people are all leaving Nepal, I think that is not good for Nepal's future.
Yeah.
So again, have to be better jobs created, and the government needs to pay attention to keeping Nepalis in Nepal. Now, I know that sometimes when Nepalis retire, then they'll come back to Nepal, right?
Okay, thanks for your suggestion. We accept in your suggestion in our country because actually नेपालमा सबै शैक्षिक जनशक्ति जसलाई भनिन्छ लिटरेट मैन पावर यहाँ बसिदियो भने we can change our country. ओके, अब यहाँले नेपाली बोलेपछि मन लाग्यो भन्नलाई हामी कार्यक्रमको अन्तमा पुगेका छौँ। जाँदा जाँदै क्यापिटल विशेष हेरिरहनु भएका विश्वभरबाट फ्रम द वर्ल्ड लाइक युर कन्ट्री अमेरिका अल्सो हैन, तपाईसँग त नेपाली साथीहरू धेरै हुनुहुन्छ हैन, सबैलाई यो कार्यक्रम मार्फत के भन्नुहुन्छ एकदमै छोटोमा? यो कार्यक्रम मार्फत फ्रम दिस प्रोग्राम what would you like to say?
Well, it's hard to sum up. I've been coming to Nepal for so many years, so it's hard to sum up in one statement. But in many ways, Nepal has changed my life. When I came here as 21, 22 years old out of America, I'd never traveled. I didn't experience a culture like this, and so I really fallen in love with Nepal and written books about it and collected books about it.
Yeah.
And as I say, Nepal is changing in many ways. It's for the good. Some of the changes maybe are not for the good. Maybe too much using the iPhone and not reading books. But I mean, I'm an older person, so that is my view. But again, I wish Nepal the best of luck. But developing democracy is a slow process. Maybe I'll end with this. In America, Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves in 1865, and it was 100 years before there was a Civil Rights Act.
Mm-hmm.
So the discrimination in America has gone way, way down. It's still there. There's still prejudiced people. Women didn't have the vote 100 years ago. So democracy is nothing that you get right away. It takes time. It evolves, and so the same is going to happen in Nepal.
Actually,
it takes some time for the institutions to develop in Nepal, and for the habits and for the practices of democracy. But Nepal is making progress. I wish more young people were politicians in Nepal from an outside view. But in America, we have a bunch of old politicians too. So, nevertheless, but I don't know. I would like to be able to come back to Nepal in 40 or 50 years, but that won't happen. So I just hope that in 40 or 50 years, Nepal will have changed much more for the better, and that it'll still be a vibrant society. And so I wish Nepalis all the luck in the world.
Okay, thank you for the question. Okay. आदरणीय दर्शकबिन, भर्खरै हामीले कुरा गर्यौं धेरै दर्जनौं पुस्तक नेपालको बारेमा लेखेर विश्वमा अथवा विशेष गरी अमेरिकामा नेपाललाई चिनाउने र विश्वभरि नेपालको ख्यातिलाई पठाइदिने आदरणीय व्यक्तित्व हुनुहुन्छ उहाँ डन एडवर्ड्स पीएचडी। उहाँले गरिरहेको काम हामी नेपालीले गर्न सक्ने भइदिएको भए गरिदिएको भए आज साँच्चै नै हातेमा लगाउन कति सहज हुन्थ्यो होला। उहाँको एउटा राम्रो विचार छ, नेपालका शैक्षिक जनशक्तिहरू नेपालमै बसिदिए भने, नेपालमै उहाँलाई रोजगारी दिन सकियो भने, उहाँहरूलाई एउटा वातावरण सिर्जना गर्न सकियो भने पक्कै पनि देशको विकास चाहिँ छिटो हुन्छ, डेमोक्रेसीको प्र्याक्टिस चाहिँ एकदमै फास्ट हुन सक्छ भनेर उहाँले सजेसन पनि दिनुभएको छ। यो समग्र कुराकानी यहाँलाई कस्तो लाग्यो? क्यापिटल विशेष हेरेर हामीलाई साथ सहयोग सुझाव सल्लाह दिनुहोला। र आज हाम्रो अतिथि डन एडवर्ड्स सँगसँगै मलाई पनि कार्यक्रमबाट बिदा दिनुहोस्। तपाईको सम्पूर्ण समय उत्तम बितोस्। नमस्कार, जय होस्।